This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we're going to be discussing how Benito Mussolini built a dictatorship in Italy in the 1920s. Now, if you've been following our podcast lately, you know that we've been doing a number of episodes on the history of Israel and Palestine, and I want you to know that we're not finished with that. We are going to continue to produce episodes on that. The next one will probably come out in a couple weeks, and we'll talk about Israeli and Palestinian society after 1948 and how they developed, especially in the 1950s. But I wanted to take a little break from that and get back to European history, because this is really the heart and soul of what we do here. This is why the podcast was initially started. And after a year of doing episodes on Israel-Palestine, I wanted to get back to European history and make sure that we kind of cover those bases as well. And in particular, obviously, we're talking about the subject of fascism. Fascism seems to be something that is very timely, that people have a lot of questions about. There's obviously always interest in Nazi Germany and the various things that Hitler was up to. So we're going to get to that. But we also wanted to take a couple episodes and walk through what happens in Italy. Because in some ways, Italy is more important in that it is the first fascist dictatorship that is set up after World War I. It's the experimental lab, if you will, in which fascism is being built. And Adolf Hitler is kind of watching some of it. Other countries, their fascist movements are watching some of it, and they will borrow some of the techniques and be inspired in some ways by some of the strategies developed by Benito Mussolini and the Partito Fascista Nazionale, or the PNF fascist party, again, in Italy. So again, we'll get back to Israel-Palestine, but today's podcast is going to be about Italy, and the next two will be about that as well. Now, one of the big questions that we have when we start talking about fascism, of course, is how does it happen? How does someone pull off gaining the kind of absolute power that a Mussolini, a Hitler, other dictators later on? How do we get that kind of absolute power? Somebody looks up to you and says that you're kind of a world historical figure, you're the leader, and we really should just do everything that you say. It's kind of scary, especially living as we do in the United States in a democracy. Many of you listen to the podcast from Europe. Most of the countries in Europe are obviously fully functioning democracies. Other places in the world, places like India, democracy. Places in Africa are now democracies, South America as well. So we have a kind of vested interest in trying to understand, how does this happen? How do you lose a democracy? How can it all go so wrong? Italy, after World War I, had been a democracy for decades. That was a constitutional monarchy, and we can explore some of the contours of Italian politics a little bit later on. But the big question here is, how do you lose a democracy? How do you wind up in a dictatorship, especially a fascist dictatorship? I think the kind of popular narrative that's out there, the expectation of how this happens, is that it basically just happens all at once, and dictatorships are imposed on democratic societies. There's some moment when the chancellor gets up and says, okay, now we're going to have a revolution. There's some moment when all the soldiers seize all the key points in the city, the barracks, the information centers. And there are some examples kind of like this in history, right? There are a couple of places like, let's say, Spain in 1936, where you have the army leading a coup. There's a civil war, and eventually Francisco Franco will take over as the new dictator. We also see this obviously in movies. If you watch something like Star Wars or Hunger Games, right? The dictatorships are either built with a kind of a sudden moment when all of a sudden we flick a switch and now we're going to be dictatorship, or it's kind of told in the past tense that this is kind of what happened before. But as we saw in our discussion on the Bolsheviks, dictatorship is rarely something that just happens independently of civil society. The way that it is often phrased of being implemented, right? It implies this kind of top-down, the party or the leader take over and they force their will, and civil society really doesn't play a role in it. And I would argue that this is in many ways very misleading, because especially in many of the early fascist states, especially in a country like Italy, a country like Germany, the fascists seize power, but they do so legally. The fascists don't just flick a switch and suddenly you're in fascism. As people are living through this experience, yes, they understand there's a drift towards authoritarianism. They understand that there are obviously some problems going on. But the death of democracy does not happen overnight. It is part of a broader process that plays out over the course of time. Another element that we would just kind of want to note very briefly again in the beginning is in our minds when we feel like, what does the dictatorship rest on? What does fascism rest on? It must be authoritarianism. It must be the violence. It must be intimidation. Of course, everyone hates Hitler. Of course, everyone hates Mussolini. It's just that they can't speak out or else bad things will happen to them. This is an element of living in a dictatorship. It is an element of early fascist society. We'll talk later on about the rule of law and how one of the things that Mussolini does once he's in power is he essentially shreds the rule of law. He transforms it into a joke. But we shouldn't let this fool us into missing the fact that oftentimes, especially in the 1920s and 30s, fascist dictatorships are popular. Fascist dictatorships win over significant segments of the masses. They don't rule only through intimidation, but one could argue that a lot of their power comes from the fact that people give it to them, that people believe in them. And so part of what we want to do today is unpack this a little bit. How does Mussolini seize power? We're going to get into a number of the legal changes that he makes. We're going to talk about the establishment, the declaration of dictatorship in 1925. But we're also going to talk about the cultural ways that he not only talks the talk, but he wins the loyalty of large segments of Italian society. If you go back and you listen to one of our first podcasts, which was about Louis XIV and how Louis XIV managed to pull off absolutism, you recall we talked about things like ballet dancing, the way he set his dinner table, all these kind of cultural rituals that he created. And we argued that that was really one of the most important ways that he achieved power, that he talked the talk of absolutism, but he got people to buy into it in a way that does not happen, especially with Louis XVI. So we're going to get into all these things today. Before we start on the formal narrative, though, I do want to make a comment about the music that I played. Those of you that have listened to some of the European episodes, you know that I usually like to start with a piece of music or a video clip or something like that. And this is a way of kind of explaining or getting into the topic at hand. And so the piece of music that you heard at the start of our podcast episode was Beniamino Gili's 1937 recording of the Italian song Giovinezza. Giovinezza is basically youth. Now, if you go back and you listen to the beginning of the song, right, it's very upbeat, it's very excited, you think youth. Some of you might be thinking, oh wow, is this the Italian Taylor Swift of the 1930s? But this is actually much different than a kind of modern pop song. It is actually much closer to 19th century anthems like the Marseillaise, the Nemzeridal. Giovinezza is a war song. It is a song about youth fulfilling the national destiny. This was something in the 19th century, especially in the middle to early part of the 19th century as nationalism is spreading. There is this idea that the world will be remade anew by the young. And the young will do this through violence. They will do it through sacrifice. They will build the nation and the future, which is kind of utopian, in a way that these old curmudgeonly, aristocrats and monarchs and medieval institutions, that stuff is, that's all passé. Burn it all down. Burn it all down and remake the world anew. Some people would argue that this kind of idealism is very popular in our world today, politically. Obviously not the first time in history that we've experienced this. Right? And so in the 19th century, there is this kind of desire, again, for kind of recreating society anew, and the youth would be the leadership of that. Now, this song is not from the 19th century. It was written in 1909 by Giuseppe Blanc, and it later became a popular anthem for Italian soldiers during World War I. And this, again, makes sense, right? What is Italy's goal in World War I? It's not just purely, we're going to get some territory. This will be great for the prestige of the monarchy. There is a real sense in Italian society that World War I is about fulfilling the promises of national unification. That the Italian people and the Italian state are supposed to be great. That they are supposed to be leaders in European culture, European society. And that part of what is going on with reunification is that finally Italy is going to emerge unified, strong, young, and it's going to start building a glorious future. And so in that sense, a song like Giovinezza makes a lot of sense. In the immediate post-war period, it is adopted by the squadrists. You remember the squadrists were these kind of sort of political gangs, if you will, that were trying to fight socialism and especially communism, especially in northern Italy and the industrial areas right after World War I. And it kind of becomes an unofficial anthem for the Italian state under Mussolini in the 1920s. And again, when you think about what is Mussolini trying to do, the public pitch is very idealistic. It's very utopian. We talked about the Bolsheviks earlier, and why do people buy into the early Soviet state with all the violence, with all the repression? And a big part of it is the utopian ideals of we're building a future society, we're building a modern Russia or Soviet Union, we're building something powerful and futuristic. And this song, Giovinezza, fits into that kind of mold. Now, I just want to point out that once it is kind of adopted by Mussolini, they rework some of the words to make it fit more closely with the fascist ideal. By the mid-1920s, for example, one of the stanzas towards the end reads, quote, "Italians are remade. They are remade by Mussolini for the war to come tomorrow, for the joy of hard work, for peace and the laurel, for those who are renegades of the patria are to be placed beneath the yoke." End quote. There's a lot going on in this one stanza that they've kind of edited a little bit, right? You still have that idea of remaking Italy, the idea of a futuristic society, right? The war that's going to come tomorrow, the idea of violence, the idea that dissent will not be tolerated. But this is not a kind of lament about, the future, it's dystopic, we won't be able to protest. It's not about rights. It is a utopian vision of a glorious future. And how do we get to that future? We get there by Benito Mussolini. So again, what this kind of illustrates is this idea of civil society working towards the dictatorship, civil society imbuing and becoming a part of the dictatorship, right? The fascists don't just come in and reinvent the wheel. In many ways, they take over existing structures, they adapt them, they create new alliances, and they win over significant sections of Italian society. It's not every single person. There are dissenters. There are people that will be what we would call dissidents today. But in the 1920s, Italian fascism is pretty darn popular. So again, in today's episode, we're going to talk about how Mussolini went about transforming the constitutional republic that he took charge of in 1922 and how he made it into the world's first fascist dictatorship. Okay, so we started with this question, how does Mussolini pull this whole thing off? And in order to answer that question, we should start by remembering that the state that he took over in late October 1922 was still a liberal democratic state. Right? It does have a king. It is a constitutional monarchy. It's not the same as a modern democracy, but it was still a liberal democratic state. Mussolini, you'll recall, did not overthrow the government, did not jail all his opponents right when he kind of took over. There were no purges. There were no, marching into Rome and kind of sacking it like Attila. Mussolini was appointed by King Victor Emmanuel III to be the prime minister. Right, again, going back into some territory we covered in our first episode on this topic, October 1922, Mussolini was planning to seize power violently. He organizes something called the March on Rome. You have these tens of thousands of black shirts. These are kind of paramilitary figures. They're marching towards Rome. And the king basically says, instead of trying to fight them and having civil war, I'll just appoint Mussolini as the new prime minister, and then I don't have to worry about it. This seizure of power through legal means is critical, especially in the early part of founding a dictatorship and taking over political power. If you are someone who believes in liberal democracy, if you do believe in the rule of law, how do you then resist when the person taking over is the law? How if, this happens in Germany, Hitler is appointed chancellor. When Hitler gives the stormtroopers, deputizes them, gives them the power of law, how do you fight back against that when the people kind of leading the coup, if you will, are doing it with legal authority? It conveys an important degree of legitimacy upon the process, and it makes it hard from a mental standpoint to resist the initial kind of takeover. Now, we should also point out that when Mussolini and the fascists take over, they don't just take over the entire government. The government that Mussolini starts heading in 1922 and 23 is a divided government. There is shared power between most of the major non-socialist parties. Now, Mussolini is going to be the prime minister, obviously the kind of most important position. He has an interesting tactic that he does. It's kind of different than the path Hitler goes down, in which he basically will take more than one minister portfolio. Right? Today, we wouldn't imagine someone being, let's say, Homeland Security Secretary, and then also the Secretary of Defense, and also the Secretary of State. People would say, wait a minute, that's too many offices. What are you doing? But Mussolini does this. Mussolini will appoint himself to be the Minister of Interior. And in European society, the Minister of Interior also controls the police. He also makes himself the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Fascists will also take over other ministries, such as the Deputy Prime Minister. They will take over the Ministry of Justice, which of course will control the court system. And they will also take over the Ministry for the Occupied Territories. But other parties, again, participate in this government, and in doing so, they legitimate it. The Ministry of Defense, of course, very important in almost every society. Right? This is the kind of chief leader of the army besides whoever the commander-in-chief might be. Well, in the early days of Italian fascism, the Minister for Defense was Armando Diaz. Armando Diaz was the supreme commander of the Italian army, who had saved the country at the Battle of Piave in 1917. He was one of the few genuine Italian war heroes to emerge from World War I. And so when people who are on the fence look at this and they say, okay, Mussolini, fascists, they're getting a lot of power here. Oh, don't worry, we've got a national hero here who's in charge of the army. And we know that he's going to help kind of keep Mussolini in check. There are a number of ministries that deal with kind of public affairs or social affairs. And these are taken over by conservative Catholics. Things like the Ministry of Works, the Treasury. Right? Don't worry about Mussolini. It's, we'll give him a chance. He can't just spend whatever he wants to. We've got good old reliable conservative Catholics in charge of the Treasury. Much of the colonial and financial administration remains the same. A lot of the police forces remain the same, especially at the national level. And so when we talk about Mussolini kind of seizing power or his rise to power, it's a mistake to look at 1922 and say, okay, at the end of 1922, he's reached the high watermark, right? The job is done. He's become a dictator. There's fascism because, again, legally speaking, he's not a dictator yet. And in a practical sense, he can't just do whatever he wants, right? He has to build this fascist society. And so again, that's kind of what we're talking about today. All right, how does he do this? One of the most basic ways he does so is through ideology. And here I don't mean fascist ideology, but more broadly speaking, this idea of promoting Italian nationalism. Again, if we go back and look at the previous 50 years of Italian history, going all the way back again to unification in the 1860s. Italians don't just think of unification as, oh, great, now, we have the same currency, now we have the same postal system. Italians think of this as the beginning of a new and glorious era created by or enabled by national unity. But that moment of glory, that golden age never got there. The Italy of the 1880s and 1890s, it's kind of industrializing. There's a lot of sort of hostility between North and South, between Catholics and people who are less religious. They get into World War I to kind of fix this problem. Could have mentioned colonialism as well. Italy tries to set up an empire. They basically seize some states, but especially 1896, they're defeated by Ethiopia, and it's an enormous embarrassment. How could you lose to Africans? And a lot of Europeans at this time, very racist, very chauvinistic. This idea that you would lose a war to Africans to them, it doesn't make sense, and it's embarrassing, and it makes them feel that instead of getting this glorious future, that something is deeply wrong. World War I is very similar, right? Italy enters World War I. They really don't have that hard a job, right? They're just going to attack the Austrians, the Austro-Hungarians, but in particular the Austrian side. And they actually end up losing a lot of territory. They, at one point, have lost most of the Veneto. So there's this desire for national glory. Mussolini talks in the rhetoric of national glory, of national renewal, of finally creating this Italy that everybody or many people wanted to see. And so as he sort of sets out on this path after World War I, after he assumes power, the idea of unity and strength is appealing to a lot of Italians who are not necessarily fascists. The idea of Italian glory. People like that. And they're willing to give Mussolini a chance to kind of pull this off. If you look below the surface, in this crucial period when Mussolini is literally building the dictatorship of 22 to 25, Mussolini's government is supported by many prominent liberal politicians. There are a lot of people who would have called themselves liberal 10, 20 years before and said, you know what, we're willing to give Mussolini these opportunities. We're willing to let him go beyond the rule of law. We're letting him cut some corners. We're letting him do some things that we don't really like because the grand project of building the nation makes it all justifiable. One of the most outstanding examples of Mussolini's success in kind of winning over ordinary people or groups that were maybe not as excited about him initially is his reconciliation with the Catholic Church. Some of you may recall that basically in the run-up to unification, there was a state called the Papal States. Papal, I know it's plural, but the Papal States basically were a kingdom like any other, except the king was not a king, it was the Pope. So the Pope was the secular authority throughout the Papal lands, which included Rome and some very prosperous parts of Italy. So Italian nationalists find themselves at odds with the papacy, right? How are we going to create Italy? Well, we have to destroy the papacy to do it. And of course, the Pope is hostile to that. There are other tensions, and you can find these in French history as well, between the idea of the church as a bastion of kind of tradition, and especially in the 19th century, these kind of radical Republicans, rationalists. They're not necessarily atheists, but many of them look at the church and see that it is kind of institutionally corrupt, they would argue. And so there's this kind of natural tension in Italian society between people who are devoutly Catholic and people who are kind of devoutly nationalist, they would say. In 1870, when the world is kind of distracted by the Franco-Prussian War, Italian nationalists will storm into the rest of Italy, into the Papal States. They will conquer it. The Pope kind of holds himself up in Rome. He says, I don't recognize any of this. I'm not coming out until you give me back the Papal States. Mussolini enters into this sort of environment in late 1922 and begins working on a reconciliation with the church. He will allow the church to take over religious instruction in the school system. He will ban Freemasonry. Freemasons, of course, emphasize rationalism. There's a long tension of sort of hostility between kind of the traditional churches and the Freemasons, right? So he's going to ban the Freemasons. He's going to ban the sale of contraception. Catholics, in theory, are not supposed to use contraception. You are interfering with the divine plan for procreation. And anything that kind of limits that and anything that kind of breaks up for that is sinful. Now, obviously, today, some would agree with that. Some people would argue with it. Things are a little different. But Mussolini, by taking some of these actions, starts to win over traditional Catholics. As I said, the most important thing he does is he will eventually negotiate a treaty with the Pope in 1929. This is called the Lateran Pact, and it basically leads to the foundation of the Vatican. The Vatican today is its own independent state. It's not very big, does not really have its own army. It's not, trying to go out and conquer new territory or set up colonies or, that kind of thing. But the Vatican is created by this 1929 Lateran Pact, and it gives the Pope the ability to say, hey, look, I still have my own country without threatening the overall unity of Italy. And so Pope Pius XI, for example, he doesn't just look at this as, well, I had to settle for this, right? This becomes a solution to the impossible relationship between nationalism and religion in Italy. Pope Pius looks at Mussolini not as some politician and he's negotiating deals and he's corrupt or he's self-centered or egotistical. Pope Pius will refer to Mussolini as, quote, the man sent by Providence, end quote. After several decades of fighting against modernity, Mussolini has unlocked a way for the Catholic Church, and in particular the Vatican, for the Pope to remain relevant in the modern world. That's a pretty big deal. And obviously, if the Pope is going around saying, you are the man of Providence, and you are a diehard religious Catholic, you are going to be receptive to Mussolini's rulership, dictatorship, whatever you want to call it, depending on the moment that you're talking about. His authority, his rule over the rule of law, it seems to be legitimate or good. Now, another thing that fascists do, and this is also true especially of the Nazis, is that they become masters of modern media. They are incredibly adept at using modern communication and information systems to present an image of themselves and of their countries that is favorable, that is appealing. One of the biggest concerns in Italian society, for example, revolves around the onset of modernity, and all of the disruptions that it brings. And we've talked about this, the way that living in the big city can create anxiety. I don't know who all my neighbors are all of a sudden. I can't control their bad behavior. I can't shield myself from it. All of a sudden, new ways of transportation, new mobility. What is all this commercialization that's going on? What is all this open sexuality that's going on? Can create a lot of anxiety. And so part of what the fascists are able to do, again, using modern media, is to create a sort of sanitized version of modernity. Now, sometimes, especially if you go back to the 1970s, 1980s, people talk about fascism as being anti-modern. I would not describe it as anti-modern. I would say it is alt-modern. It invents its own idea of modernity where things are strong and powerful and mechanized. But it is sanitized from some of the disruptions that people don't want to see, right? Some of the seedier side, some of the things that when we allow for more liberty, people do things we don't like, things that make us uncomfortable. It's a big issue here in almost all these societies with the idea of the stranger and who's a member of the community and who's not. When I know all of my neighbors, when I live in a small town of 1,000 people, I feel pretty confident. I feel pretty good about myself. But what happens when people I don't know come in and now I'm dependent on those people? And this is part of the transition to modernity, and we talked about this in great detail. So what fascism does is it begins to produce an image of society that is clean, that is ordered. It embraces this idea of power and masculinity, not because, well, once the leader has all the power, he's just going to do whatever he wants, right? Not that stereotypical image of Louis XVI that we saw in Mel Brooks's History of the World. But it's more the idea of the father figure, right? I am the dad. I'm the one that sets the rules. I'm going to make sure everybody does what they should be doing. And I'm going to run this household for the benefit of everybody inside of it. This is in many ways what fascism is kind of projecting through media, through language, through ideology, etc. Why are fascist countries so invested in the idea of violence and the idea of warfare and the idea of kind of hardening oneself, steeling oneself, strength? Because once you have strength, once you have that kind of sang-froid, right, the cold-bloodedness, then you have power. Then you control events. So power and control over modernity are a key part of what we're talking about here. Now, one of the ways that we can see this is reflected in the language that fascists used in the media itself. Mussolini encouraged the idea of his own infallibility in the press, not just in fascist papers, as you might expect, but one of the things that they're masters of is they go to a more neutral press and they say to the editor, you know what, we'll give you a little bit of extra money. Why don't you write a nice story about how awesome Mussolini is? Or they might go to another paper and say, you know what, we noticed that your last story was a little too critical of Mussolini. It would really be good for you and your safety if you happen to write a more positive outlook. So either through bribery or cajoling, they get people, not just in the fascist media, but outside of that, to build this narrative of Mussolini is amazing. Mussolini is the world historical figure. Mussolini should be the leader of the nation. One of the things that Mussolini does is he has subordinates repeat the phrase, Mussolini is always right. This becomes a kind of just, okay, we're arguing about something, debating, blah, blah, blah. Well, Mussolini is always right. Now, this doesn't mean that people believe that Mussolini is literally always right. But you say it again and again and again, and the impression that it gives people is that Mussolini is more often than not right. Mussolini is the type of guy who is almost always correct. Another kind of interesting way they do this is through pronouns. We're living here in 2024. People are very enthusiastic about pronouns, whether they're excited about changing pronouns or declaring their pronouns, or they're very upset that you're telling them what your pronouns are. We have this kind of issue in society, I guess you could put it, about pronouns these days. This is not the first time that people have ever cared about pronouns. When he is dictator, Mussolini will require in the 1930s that journalists capitalize his pronouns. When you write his government or his trip to the Adriatic, you have to capitalize his. And why do we do that? Because you're showing in a kind of ritualistic way that Mussolini is special. Mussolini is not like ordinary people. There is something unique about him. Now, of course, there's some of you out there, when you write the word God, you do this, right? You would never write God with a lowercase g because it's disrespectful. God is something different. God is something special. And so through your orthography, you indicate that and you practice it and you learn it and you internalize it. Mussolini tries to cultivate this idea, this image of being larger than life, of again being a kind of world historical figure, a man of destiny. Later on during the dictatorship, when you swear allegiance, you do not swear allegiance to the country. You swear allegiance to Mussolini. We'll see later on when we talk about German fascism, one of the most consequential moments, perhaps, of Hitler's rise to power is when he does a deal with the German army and he says, okay, I will basically take out the SA. In exchange for that, you don't swear allegiance to Germany or to the Constitution. You swear allegiance to me personally. So Mussolini is also doing this. If you have ever been around the stereotypical Italian guy in New York, you will know, maybe not in mixed company, but if you're in with a bunch of men, Italian men have this kind of stereotypical reputation of being very sexual, of doing catcalls, of hubba hubba, and being very masculine. Mussolini embraces all of this. Right? He boasts about his sexual prowess because he wants you to know that he's not just an ordinary guy, a normal guy, a politician. He is, in the language of today, he's an alpha. He's out there. He's vigorous. He wants conquest. He believes in power. He uses power. And that's not just in political terms, but also in sexual terms as well. Puts a lot of medals on his chest. We see this, of course, today. Many dictators, what's the first thing you do is you deck yourself out in a military uniform. You give yourself a lot of medals because that makes you seem more masculine. Another example that I could give you from the period, a very popular fascist slogan, which was, quote, better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep, end quote. Right? The idea here that what's important in life is that you seize it, that you control it, that you exert agency, and whether you live a long time is kind of irrelevant. You should master life. You should be in control. And that's much better than just survival. Now, how much people actually took these slogans as literal truth is up for grabs, is debatable. But they all contribute to this image, this sense that whether you like Mussolini or not, he is a tough guy. He's a strong man. He is the kind of manly man that is going to use power and violence. And so you better respect that about him. Now, complementing this kind of rhetorical effort to kind of describe Mussolini is, as I mentioned, fascist use of media and especially images and visual spectacle to project notions of strength and order. Mussolini, for example, is often photographed being active. He doesn't want you to see him in a suit and tie, hanging out at the gala, being at some wealthy club. He wants you to see him running. He's playing tennis. He's fencing, right? His masculinity is not just, well, he claims these things, but it is literally in his physical prowess. I'm going to say something here that's going to shock some of you. You know that there are many men out there, when they start to go bald a little bit, they shave their heads. Some men don't even wait till they're going bald. They just shave their heads. And they would say, I look better with a shaved head. Mussolini is the one that first kind of creates that style And it is because of issues of masculinity. One of the kind of funny things about, Mr. Super Masculine here is that he had gray hair very early on, right? His hair not only kind of balding, but he started going gray early, like kind of Steve Martin. And it's hard to create an image of being super powerful and super strong and super athletic when you've got gray hair. Right? Imagine someone like Michael Jordan, and he's in his late 30s, and he's still playing basketball. He's still trying to be the king of the court, the best that there ever was. But instead of shaving his head, he's just got like kind of long, shaggy gray hair, and it's balding. He probably still would be an amazing basketball player, but the image wouldn't be quite the same. And so this is what happens to Mussolini. He says, I can't look old. I can't look like I'm going gray. And so he shaves his head, and he begins to create this image of being bald and associating that with being kind of strong as a man. Another thing he likes to do, and I think I talked about this in the previous episode, he has pet lions, and he's always sort of photographed around these lions, because who on earth would keep a pet lion or a pet tiger? If you've seen the movie The Hangover, well, Mike Tyson keeps one. And nobody found that weird. They said, oh, yeah, Mike Tyson seems like the type of person that would keep baby tigers. Or I guess in the movie, it's not even a baby. It's like an adult tiger. But that's because we associate Mike Tyson with uber masculinity. Right? Who's going to keep a tiger? Not a normal person. Mussolini and the early fascists will also invest heavily in film. In 1924, they create something called Unione Cinematografica Educativa, or LUCE, L-U-C-E. And this basically was responsible for the production and dissemination of documentaries and newsreels at all Italian cinemas. Starting in 1927, they began preparing introductory newsreels to be played before any movie. Now, as you might imagine, these introductory newsreels always show Mussolini as being strong, the man of destiny. Look at the new marshes that we've drained. Look at the new Autobahn that we're building. Of course, they call it the Autostrada. Look at this new glorious Italy that we are building. Now, you might not care about politics. There are a lot of people out there that don't care about politics. We have a presidential election coming up in a couple months here in the United States. A whole bunch of people don't care. It's not on their radar. Everything is the same. Okay. But in Italy in the 1930s, when these people go to a movie theater, before you get to watch your movie that you might be interested in, you get a little bit of political propaganda. And so again, you might not know much about Mussolini. You might not care. You might not have a lot of deep thoughts about what the government should look like, or the laws, or the Senate, or whatever. But you've seen this real clip, and you know that Mussolini is doing good things. Later on, they, like the Bolsheviks and the Germans, will also start making films to reinforce fascist ideals. If you're a film buff, you could check out the 1937 hit Scipio Africanus, The Defeat of Hannibal, which of course is celebrating historical Italian military successes. It's coming out right after the conquest of Ethiopia, which we'll talk about more in the next episode. And so it's, not so subtly, kind of wink, wink. We're celebrating Mussolini. We're celebrating the recreation of the Roman Empire. Finally, one last kind of cultural thing that we should note revolves around the idea of sport. Fascists, especially starting in Italy, love celebrating sports. When you think about the most popular modern day sports in the world today, when you think about soccer, when you think about rugby, when you think about American football, these sports start as a way of creating a masculine environment where we can encourage kind of hitting, physicality, strength, but we do so in a way that is still controlled. When you go on the football field, even though, people hit each other and, okay, let's go, and they get fired up, it's still in a controlled environment. You still have positions, you have jobs, you have captains, you have coaches. And so the idea is that you are kind of creating this vigorous masculinity, but it's not uncontrolled or unbounded masculinity. And so therefore it's acceptable. In fascist Italy, this idea of building new Italians, of building a new society, of building a new masculinity, it gets applied via sports as well. Perhaps the best example of fascist obsession with sport is related actually to the World Cup. First World Cup is played in Montevideo in 1930. It is played in the middle of course, the Great Depression. There are not a ton of teams that go to it, especially from Europe, right? Costs are high. It's kind of question how successful this is going to be. But Mussolini says, wait a minute, this is sports, this is conquest, this is masculinity, this is spectacle. We are going to show the world the power of the new fascist Italy through soccer, or football if you prefer. Mussolini will bring the Second World Cup to Italy in 1934. He not only subsidizes the construction of stadiums and the preparation of venues like countries do today, right? There's a lot of investment that goes into hosting these games. Most of them actually lose quite a bit of money. But Mussolini says, I will subsidize foreign teams and fans' traveling costs. We are so desperate to show you how dominant we are that we will, in the middle of the Great Depression, pay for you to come to Italy to watch soccer. I don't know about you, but I would love that today. Maybe not Mussolini's Italy, but I'd like to be invited to go to the World Cup and have somebody else pay for the whole thing. In the end, in a somewhat controversial final, Italy wins 2-1 over Czechoslovakia, and Mussolini has the propaganda triumph that he has long predicted. Look, at this point, he's been in power for just over a decade. What is it that we have built? We have built a strong, tough, victorious Italy. We are getting that national glory that you wanted after unification in 1870, that you thought you were going to get with liberal democracy, that you thought you were going to get with World War I. We are building this new, powerful Italy. There's a lot more that we could go into in terms of culture. There's a lot about fascist dress that we could talk about. One of my favorite, kind of in a comical way sort of things, Mussolini's deputy, Achille Strachey, does, is that he requires people to start using the Roman salute instead of the handshake. Now, the handshake is foreign, it's feminine. What do you do? You're touching each other in the palm of your hands? Come on, we're Romans. We're tough. We're the people that conquered Europe and North Africa and parts of the Middle East. Let's give our big Roman salute. From a modern perspective, it all seems kind of silly and kind of, inflated and ridiculous. But for people during the period, it was a way of kind of working fascist ideals and ideology into everyday life. One final comment that I want to make before we get into, again, these kind of legal questions, which we've kind of skirted so far, is another way that Mussolini and more broadly the PNF party take over society is through something that the German philosopher Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. This isn't the place to go into a long discussion of the banality of evil, but basically it's the idea that people don't necessarily do evil things because they understand them to be evil and they, say, oh, I just hate, I hate these people over here. I'm going to hurt them. It's not necessarily that they are ideological zealots. Oftentimes people will do evil acts because it's part of getting ahead. It's part of what you need to do to advance. I may not feel so strongly about a particular, ideological current or cultural thing going on at my university, but I say, yeah, sure, I'm all for it because I know that it just makes things easier. Now, I'm not saying I actually do that. I'm saying that's just something one person could do. If you were living in Italy in the early 1920s and you wanted to get somewhere, you wanted to become a university professor, you're going to apply for some job at, prestigious institution, well, you better be a party member. They're going to look at your application and say, is this person reliable? Can I put them into a position of authority? Do I want them to be, the senior vice president of a bank if they're not really on board with the team? And so membership in the fascist party will more than triple between 1923 and 1927. And it's not necessarily because people said, oh, wow, Mussolini is amazing. Oh, I decided to become a fascist today, although there is some of that. But there are a lot of people that just, okay, this is what I got to do. How many of you, when you were in high school, did things not because you really cared about them, but because you thought, that's going to look really good on my college application? Right? I volunteered at the senior home and I spent time with them. I worked on a little league team. How many of you would say, I generally love being around people in like nursing homes? Some of you do. Some of you say, I feel very religious. I feel very devoted to society. The idea of community is so important to me. My grandma is in such a situation and I care about the other people there. But there are a lot of people, especially high school students, that do stuff like that just to put it on the resume. You joined this club. Why'd you join the club? Well, it would look good on the college application. It's the same kind of mentality that's driving people towards the party in Italy in the mid-1920s. Mussolini is happening. Fascism is the thing. If I want to get ahead, if I'm a dentist and I want to make new clients, well, I'm going to join the party. And I'll go to the party and at the party meetings and stuff. And I'll say, oh, I'm a dentist. Oh, you need some work on your teeth. Hey, I'm on the team. So there are a lot of people that get involved in fascism for kind of secondary or tertiary reasons. Think about another example of this, right? One of the things that happens is that over the course of time, you get these patronage networks. You get the kind of local boss of the fascist party in the small town. And if you want to get a job, let's say working at the railroad that he happens to run, well, you better subscribe to the local party paper. You better frequent his cafe if he owns a cafe or his restaurant. So you get these patronage networks. And the patronage networks are not about ideology per se. It just becomes the rhythm of life, the way that you do the things that you would normally do. At the same time that all this is going on, Mussolini and his PNF party will assault judicial and legal norms from within the Italian state. The first major blow to Italian democracy came in November 1923 with the passage of something called the Acerbo Law. Now, the Acerbo Law basically was created to try to stabilize Italian politics. If you know anything about Italian politics, you know that it's very chaotic. It's a parliamentary system, especially since World War II. You have governments that last for a couple months. The current Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, has been there since October of 2022. This is almost 2 years, and this is a huge deal in Italian politics. That's a long time to last as the Italian Prime Minister. Just to give you an idea, since 1945, there have been 69 Italian governments. 69, almost one per year. By contrast, we've had 14 American presidents in that time span. So Italian politics is turbulent, and if you want to try to get anything done, the question is, well, do we need to have some kind of reforms so that we don't get paralysis? What if we elect, we have multiple parties in the system and everybody gets about 10% of the vote? It's going to be hard to actually get anything accomplished. And for Mussolini, things are actually even a little bit harder because technically there were only 2 fascists out of 535 deputies in the initial Italian parliament. Now, in reality, there were actually more like 35. Some of these fascists would run on other parties' lists. But 35 out of 535 is not a working majority, as you might imagine. So basically, the Acerbo Law is about creating stability. And what it does is it says, whoever gets the majority in the parliamentary election, as long as it's over 25%, they are automatically going to get 2/3 of the seats in parliament so that they can pass their agenda. Now think about that for a second. If we just said whoever gets the majority in the U.S. House of Representatives, the majority of votes in the United States Senate, they get 2/3 of the seats, imagine how different American politics would work. Now, a lot of you would say, actually, this doesn't sound very democratic. This sounds very bad. Like we in the United States, we're all about checks and balances. This sounds horrible. But many of Italy's liberal politicians, including former prime ministers such as Salandra, Giolitti and Orlando, backed the move because they thought it would bring stability and that it would help fight communism. So this law passes, and Mussolini will, despite not really having a large party in the actual parliament, Mussolini will get 2/3 of the seats and will be able to basically do whatever he feels like. Now, at the same time that this is going on, fascists make a mockery of the notion of the rule of law. Squadrists that are running around in the early 1920s, even into the mid-1920s, they basically are given amnesty. The police kind of look the other way. There are some elections that take place, but these elections are not free and fair as we would think of today. They often involve a lot of intimidation. One of the most prominent Italian fascists that we'll talk about more in the next episode, because he becomes the governor essentially of Libya, but his name was Italo Balbo, and he had a really interesting approach to electoral politics. He said on the first day, find the first voter at the booth, and don't even ask them who they voted for. Don't worry about who they voted for. Just beat the ever-living heck out of them. And when you do it, make sure you yell, "Bastard, you voted for the socialists." Now, whether that guy actually voted for the socialists or not is irrelevant. Every other person standing in line is going to see that and go, I don't want to be associated with the socialists. Either I'm going to do it, on the down low and hope that nobody notices, or, I'm definitely for Mussolini. I'm definitely for the fascists. I'd like everyone to know that so that I don't get my butt kicked. So again, these kind of ways of sending the quote-unquote correct message help the fascists achieve power, regardless of what everybody was thinking, right? In a physical sense, they intimidate the opposition. In July of 1923, local prefects were empowered to seize the papers of any journalist that damaged the national credit at home or abroad. It's not hard to imagine, in a world full of people like Vladimir Putin, how criticizing the leader is interpreted as criticizing the state or the nation, and that can lead to a long jail time. One of the things that they do in Italy is they, accuse you of having insulted the national honor, right? You violated this law. We're taking your paper over and we're going to give it to someone else. And of course, that goes to someone who is sympathetic to Mussolini and the fascist cause. Now, most of these trends began before 1925, when Italy was still technically a republic. But erosion in the faith of democracy proceeded quickly, and in January of 1925, it was declared a dictatorship. Now, the triggering event behind this was the 1924 assassination of a socialist politician named Giacomo Matteotti. Matteotti had seen some of these tactics that someone like Balbo was using, had seen the fraud, had seen the intimidation, and he accuses Mussolini and the PNF publicly of basically having rigged the election. 11 days after having done this, make this public accusation, he was kidnapped and beaten to death by a group of squadrists. Now, it's not clear if they actually meant to kill him or if they were just trying to beat him up and send a message, but either way, they kill him and then they drive around for a couple hours with the body in the car because they can't figure out what to do with him. For 2 months, there are searches carried out to find this socialist politician. Remember, Italy is still technically in 1924 a republic. You should still have the right to freedom of speech. You should still be able to be a member of parliament from an opposition party, which this guy was, Matteotti. But of course, he is kidnapped and murdered, and this produces quite a bit of outrage. On June 26, 1924, several parties actually withdrew from parliament in protest. And this tended to be the socialists, the communists, and some of the liberals who were concerned about this issue of the rule of law. They created something called the Aventine Secession. And their idea was to put political pressure on the king to basically dismiss Mussolini. Now, for several months, kind of tensions were rising, right? It's a question of what's going to happen. There's kind of a standoff. And then on September 12th, a fascist deputy named Giovanni Corvi was murdered as revenge for Matteotti. Members of the opposition openly began speaking of rebellion. But at the same time, members of the fascist parties, the PNF, the Squadrists, they started talking about rebelling if Mussolini didn't act. Now, it's kind of interesting here because when we think about dictatorships, we think about fascist states, obviously we think a lot about Hitler, someone who's decisive, who dominates German politics. There's very little pressure put on Hitler after 1934 by any sort of outside group. Mussolini, on the other hand, even though he claims to be this man of destiny, he's more like a surfer kind of riding on top of this sort of fascist wave in some ways than he is someone who controls it. And so basically, Mussolini has to choose. Do you have your own people overthrow you and replace you with someone that's more, kind of hardcore, going to have more of a stronger crackdown? Or are you going to crack down on these liberals and socialists and communists? And so basically, he chooses, obviously, to stay on top of the wave. Mussolini will lead a crackdown. The triggering event to this actual crackdown comes in November 1924. Basically, members of the opposition meet with the king. They plead with him, dismiss Mussolini, please end this. And the king says, no, I will stand by Mussolini. And so on January 3rd, 1925, with the king's support, Mussolini declares a dictatorship. Now, technically, the dictatorship did not replace the king. The king is still there, but basically the leader will have all the powers of government and there will be no checks on what he wants to do. Over the course of the rest of the late 1920s and early 1930s, with this dictatorship in place, they begin dismantling any of the kind of legal or Republican protections that most of us would expect in a liberal democratic society. For example, in February 1926, local communal governments are disbanded, and they will be replaced with a magistrate appointed directly by Mussolini. If you're American out there, imagine if tomorrow they passed a law and they said, we're not going to have mayors or city councils anymore. Instead, there's just going to be a kind of presidential appointee, and that person will function as the mayor over your town. Now, this person was known as the podestà. This was a medieval term, but it basically created a local position where the person had all legislative and executive power for the municipality, and they held it for a 5-year term or until Mussolini decided to dismiss them. On January 10th, press freedoms were curtailed in order to suppress what they would describe as verbal sedition. In October of 1926, we had a failed assassination attempt on Mussolini, and this led to further radicalization. Opposition parties and associations were either banned or dissolved, with the police receiving the right to exile opponents of the regime. They go on to set up a special tribunal for the defense of the state, which would prosecute opponents of the regime beyond constitutional safeguards. It was run by fascist army officers, and over the course of its existence, it had almost 1,000 arrests, including the communist leader Antonio Gramsci. Of course, as those of you who are familiar with fascist Germany or Bolshevik Soviet Union know, these regimes always like to have a kind of police force, a secret police, or like the Gestapo. They're kind of above the law. They don't have to follow the rules of the Constitution. Well, the fascists in Italy do this as well. They set up an organization known as the Organizzazione di Vigilanza Repressione del Antifascismo, or if that's quite a mouthful, as it is for me. I don't really speak Italian, so apologize for my pronunciation. But it's known by the acronym OVRA, O-V-R-A. OVRA kept files on more than 130,000 Italian citizens. They organized targeted assassinations, including killing Italian dissidents who were living abroad. Now, OVRA does not ever really get to be the size of the Gestapo or the NKVD. In terms of its power, it's kind of like a junior version of them. They do have prisons set up for political prisoners. These prisons are quite unpleasant. The regime is not really that occupied with the welfare of political prisoners, sort of similar to the Soviet Union in some regards. But it is not quite the same as Nazi Germany. The goal of putting people in Italian prison camps is not to work them to death as it is in the Gulag, or as we'll see once we start talking about Nazi Germany. Why do they build concentration camps? Especially by the time you get to the late 1930s, the idea is slave labor. The idea is, well, let's get bodies, let's get people that we can work to death or exhaust and kind of profit from that. The Italian case is not quite that bad. One of the things that you could do is if your friend or relative was arrested, you could actually help them out by purchasing extra food or clothing. And the state actually did often respond to pleas for mercies, provided that the prisoner showed the appropriate level of submission. So again, it's not quite as ghastly as the German or Soviet experiences, which do lead to the deaths of millions and millions of people. Again, another just sort of brief example of this way that the dictatorship is built legally after 1925. Basically, in 1926, all youth organizations were folded into the Opera Nazionale Balilla, which was basically the Italian Boy Scouts. Unions were liquidated, and industrialist organizations were forced to basically become fascists. And basically, what they would do is, again, very similar to the German case. They would say, okay, if you have a grievance, come to the state. The state will mediate between industry and the workforce, and will make the best decisions for everyone involved. In 1926, the Rocco Law banned strikes and lockouts. Right? So we can see this example of the corporate fascist state, the way that they try to insert themselves and to solve the labor issues that created all those striking workers in northern Italy. How do we deal with that? The state will just step in and mediate directly. We could continue talking about the kind of contours and context of Italian society. One of the things, again, that I mentioned, you have these patronage networks that get set up. Some people involved in fascism probably didn't care so much about fascism at all, or socialism, or anything. They just wanted power, and so they set up their own little local patronage networks. I'll also just briefly mention, for those that are curious, the issue of racism in Italy. There is some racism prevalent in Italian fascism. It does extend beyond just the kind of individual cultural level of racism, right, looking down on people in Africa, etc. You will get a series of laws, especially in the late 1930s, as Italy becomes more tightly tied to Germany, where they will try to racialize their society. In November 1938, for example, Italy passes a racial discrimination law. It strips Jews and Italians of African descent of their civil rights. It banishes Jewish authors and restricts the access of Jews to higher education. The PNF would also outlaw miscegenation, right, sexual relations between the different races. But these efforts at discrimination don't penetrate as deeply or are not implemented as systemically in Italian society as they were in a place like Germany. Right? Even though the law is that you're not supposed to racially mix, as we'll see on our next podcast when we talk about the war in Ethiopia, there are plenty of Italian soldiers that are interested in that and that carry out relations with people from different races. Their virulence of Italian anti-Semitism, it's like it's on the books, but its enforcement is somewhat spotty, and it's actually something that pisses the Germans off quite a bit. Final cultural thing just to note, we could also talk a lot about the cult of domesticity. We've talked a lot about Italians and men and masculinity here. The flip side of that is to redefine women primarily through the idea of not just femininity, but especially motherhood and domesticity. The idea that the woman is supposed to be in charge of the household in the sense of cleaning, cooking, childcare. And it's not just, okay, we're going to pigeonhole these women, we're going to lock them into the house and forget about them and marginalize them and make them into a kind of slaves. Italian fascism, like German fascism, celebrates domesticity, celebrates the woman. Says, look, this mom with 8 kids is a hero. They actually start awarding medals to larger families. right? You get 10 kids, we are going to give you an official government medal to celebrate your achievement as a mother. Now, obviously, if you didn't want to be a mother, right, this is repressive. This is, we would say that this is inequality. Right? We would look down on this today and reject it. But people living through fascism, many of them liked this idea, or at least a number of them did. Okay, I'm sorry we don't have more time to go into that, but we'll have to save that for another day. Basically, to summarize everything that we've been talking about, by 1929, Mussolini's control over the state was essentially complete. Most opposition leaders lived in exile or in jail, and all opposition parties had been banned. In 1928, electoral law was changed so that elections became a referendum, where people voted to approve a list submitted by the Fascist Grand Council, not based on who decided to run for election. Now, the results of the election the following year were probably what you might expect in a modern dictatorship, with 89.6% of Italians voting in the first such referendum to support the regime. As Italy entered the 1930s, Mussolini had established firm control over state and society and only owed nominal deference to the king and to his party through the Fascist Grand Council. Now, once World War II starts, the Grand Council actually doesn't meet until its final meeting in the summer of 1943. So basically, the king is the only one really with the power to dismiss Mussolini, but the king is very happy because Mussolini has so far been quite successful. Okay, we're going to end things here for now. In our next episode, we'll see what Mussolini did with all this power, and we'll focus in particular on Italy and Mussolini basically being at war. We'll talk a lot about World War II, obviously, but we'll also get into the 1935 conquest of Ethiopia, which is a really, really big deal. One could argue it's actually the high watermark of Italian fascism. We'll talk a little bit about the Spanish Civil War, a little bit about the invasion of Albania, Greece, other places during World War II, but all of that is still in front of us. For now, let me say thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you want to know more about our podcast, you can find an overview of all the episodes on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. That's all for now. Hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.